The day everything changed wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost peaceful. The kind of peaceful that tricks you into thinking you're safe. I remember the morning sun filtering through the trees, the sound of birds overhead, and the soft splash of my daughter's fishing line hitting the lake. That was the moment I realized what we'd lost and what we were about to find. My name is Jason Delmar, and 2 months ago, my 13-year-old daughter Maya and I moved into Cedar Brook Hills, a picturesque neighborhood tucked between the forests of northern Oregon. After losing my wife Clara to a brutal battle with ovarian cancer, I needed to escape the hospital smells, the constant silence in our too-big house, and the ghost of grief that clung to every room. Maya needed peace. I needed a second chance. I'd spent nearly 2 decades building a tech consulting firm, then sold it for more money than I knew what to do with. People said I'd won the game. But what's the point of winning when the one you love the most isn't around to celebrate? Clara always loved the water. Fishing was our thing. Me, her, and Maya. Out on the lake every Saturday morning with a cooler full of lemonade and a playlist of 90s rock ballads. It was our family ritual. And after her passing, it was the only thing that still made Maya smile. So when I found a house with lake access, Cedar Brook Hills with its tree-lined paths, tight-knit community, and a glittering private lake, I thought I'd found our sanctuary. The realtor talked fast about high property values and an active HOA committed to preserving the neighborhood's integrity. But I wasn't listening. My eyes were locked on the water. I'd buy the house for the lake alone. For the first few weeks, things were quiet. Maya started smiling again. We'd wake up early every Saturday, grab our rods, and head down to the dock before anyone else stirred. It was working. We were healing. Then she arrived. That morning, Maya had just caught her second sunfish and was beaming with pride, asking if we could keep a photo of it in her room. I pulled out my phone, got ready to snap the picture, when a sharp voice sliced through the air like a cold wind. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" She was in her late 50s, dressed head to toe in immaculate white athleisure, not a hair out of place under a sun visor that screamed authority. Her name, according to the engraved tag on her HOA clipboard, was Elaine Brewster. I stood up, still holding the rod, trying to remain calm. "Good morning. Just fishing with my daughter. We live here. House 41 on Pine Bend Lane." She didn't shake my hand, didn't smile, just tapped furiously on her tablet and narrowed her eyes at me like I was some kind of intruder. "Mr. Delmar, fishing is not permitted in Cedar Brook Lake. It's against HOA Regulation 8.3. This is a formal violation. A $500, 0 cents fine will be issued." I blinked. "What?" The realtor said. "Residents could fish here. That was one of the reasons we—" "The regulation was updated last month." She cut me off, flipping her screen toward me. Sure enough, there it was. Recreational Use Amendment, Fishing Prohibited. Dated exactly 4 weeks ago. I shook my head. We never received any notice. "It was emailed to all residents," she said briskly. "Perhaps you didn't check your spam folder." Maya glanced up at me, her face folding inward. The joy from her second sunfish faded instantly. "But we weren't hurting anything," she whispered. Elaine pursed her lips. "Hooks are dangerous to wildlife, and the smell of bait disrupts the morning routines of several residents." I looked at her tiny tackle box. There was no smell, no disruption, just my daughter, trying to feel normal again. I clenched my jaw, still trying to keep my tone measured. Elaine didn't care. "Mr. Delmar, perhaps you don't understand the culture we uphold here at Cedar Brook Hills. This isn't a public campground. Residents expect a certain standard. Then she glanced at Maya. Just a glance, but it was enough to twist the knife. New homeowners sometimes struggle to understand our values. The implication hit me like a slap. This wasn't about hooks, or bait, or even fish. This was about control. About people like Elaine deciding who fits and who doesn't. Maya's shoulders sagged. Her hand, which moments ago had proudly held a fish, now hung limp by her side. I turned to her. "Let's pack up." Elaine smiled. The kind of smile you see on a chess player who just moved their queen into position. I'll be mailing the details of the fine to your HOA account. I suggest checking your inbox more regularly to avoid further misunderstandings. She turned and walked off, not waiting for a response. Maya wiped a tear from her cheek as she reeled in her line. "Why was that lady so mean, Dad? We didn't do anything wrong." I knelt beside her. How could I explain prejudice masked as policy? Power disguised as regulation. Some people, I said softly, care more about rules than about kindness. That afternoon, I sat at my desk, scouring through every email, every HOA update. Nothing. No amendment, no notice, no warning. Then I started reading through the HOA charter. Legalese layered on legalese. But buried in the footnotes, I found something curious. The lake wasn't even owned by the HOA. That night, I stood at the window, watching the lake shimmer under the moonlight, wondering how far Elaine would go to keep control, and how far I was willing to go to take it back. Because if Elaine thought a $500 0-cent fine and a power trip could scare me off, she had no idea who she was dealing with. And I wasn't just a man who'd lost everything. I was a man who had everything to fight for. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the look on Maya's face, the way her shoulders dropped, the way she whispered, "We didn't do anything wrong." That question echoed through my chest like a drum beat. And I realized something. I wasn't just upset. I was angry. Not the kind of explosive anger that makes you yell, the cold kind, the kind that settles in your bones and stays there until you do something about it. By morning, I had two goals. Find out who actually owned Cedarbrook Lake, and figure out exactly who Elaine Brewster really was. The HOA website didn't offer much, just the usual fluff, architectural rules, lawn height guidelines, restrictions on what color you can paint your mailbox. But when I dug into the public county land records, something jumped out. The lake wasn't owned by the HOA. It was owned by Silver Pine Development Group, the original developers of Cedarbrook Hills. The HOA only had leased access rights, which were due to expire in less than 2 months. Now that changed everything. If the lease wasn't renewed, control of the lake could go to anyone with enough cash and the right contacts. And if I was reading the financial disclosures right, Silver Pine was in trouble. Deep trouble. I needed advice, legal, historical, and personal. So the next morning, I walked down the street and knocked on the door of a home I'd passed a dozen times. A craftsman-style house with a retired attorney placard next to the doorbell. A man in his 70s answered, wearing a vintage blazer and a skeptical frown. "You must be Jason," he said before I even introduced myself. "Word travels fast when you challenge Queen Elaine." His name was Harlan Kimball, a former ethics attorney who lived in Cedarbrook Hills since the community broke ground 20 years ago. Over coffee, strong, black, and bitter like his opinion of the HOA, he gave me a history lesson. "Elaine's been president of the HOA for 7 straight years," Harlan said, "and she's run it like a private fiefdom. People don't question her, Not unless they want to deal with citations for lawn edging or unsanctioned porch decor. I raised an eyebrow. Sounds petty. He leaned back in his chair. It's strategic. Those violations create pressure. Pressure creates sales. And when homes get sold in distress, guess who's waiting to scoop 'em up? My stomach tightened. Elaine? He nodded. Through various shell companies. She runs a boutique real estate firm that specializes in flipping properties in high-value neighborhoods, like this one. She uses the HOA to squeeze people until they give up and sell. And the lake? I asked. Harlan's smile faded. That's her end game. She's been trying to buy it for years. The fishing ban wasn't about wildlife. It was about making the lake less accessible so fewer residents push back when she finally privatizes it.
My hands curled into fists. It wasn't just about my daughter's smile anymore. It wasn't about a stupid fine. This was a pattern of manipulation, and people had been quietly suffering for years. As I left Harlan's place, he said one last thing. If you really want to fight her, don't just get angry, get smart. Later that week, I was introduced to Clara Robinson, another longtime resident and one of the only people who had dared run against Elaine in an HOA election years ago. She lost. Badly. I thought people wanted change, Clara said, shaking her head. Turns out most people just want to be left alone. Even if it means living under a dictatorship with manicured lawns. But Clara hadn't given up completely. She handed me a flash drive. I've been documenting everything for years. Fines, citations, suspicious sales, even her private events by the lake. I opened a few files. There she was, Elaine Brewster, sipping champagne at exclusive HOA board socials held lakeside, complete with catered food and loud music. The same lake where she fined me for sitting quietly with my kid. The hypocrisy was nauseating. A few days later, Clara invited me to a small gathering at her house. 4 other residents were there. All had their own stories. A single mom who got fined for having excessive holiday decorations. A veteran whose flagpole was labeled unauthorized structure. A retired teacher who was told his solar panels disrupted the neighborhood aesthetic. Each one of them had fought back. Each one had been buried in paperwork, threats, and fees until they gave up. Until now. This can't go on, said Marcus, the teacher. But people are scared, or tired, or both. I nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time someone wasn't. We started a private group chat, carefully curated and encrypted. Harlan dubbed it the Resistance as a joke, but the name stuck. I dug deeper. I used every connection I had from my years in tech and finance. I called in favors from old colleagues. I analyzed Elaine's shell companies, tracked property transfers, and traced financials. What I found confirmed our worst suspicions. Elaine was overleveraged. Her empire was built on loans and illusions. She was betting everything on acquiring the lake. If someone else bought it first, her whole plan would collapse. And I had just the kind of capital that could make that happen. But timing was key. We wait, said Harlan. Wait until she goes all in, publicly commits, spends money, makes promises, and then we pull the rug, I finished. Everyone nodded. Maya didn't know the details, but she knew something was shifting. You seem different, she said one night while we sat in the living room. Like, focused. I smiled and hugged her. I'm fighting for something that matters. She paused. For the lake? For more than that, I said quietly. For people who've been pushed around. For what's right. And for you. Because when bullies hide behind bylaws, when power is used not to protect but to profit, someone has to draw the line, and I was ready to step over it. It's funny how power shifts. Sometimes it doesn't happen with a fight or a vote. Sometimes it happens quietly in a downtown office over black coffee and a signed deed. A week after Clara handed me that flash drive, I knew exactly what I had to do. Elaine thought she held all the cards. She strutted around the community like a queen, giving speeches at HOA meetings, floating proposals for lake beautification projects that masked her real intention: private development. She had even hired a design firm to create digital renderings of a fancy, members only lakeside lounge. And the worst part, people were starting to believe her. I heard it'll raise property values, one neighbor told me during a morning walk. Elaine says we'll get better security and maintenance, another mentioned while trimming his hedges. What they didn't know was that Elaine was trying to fund this project by pushing a special assessment, an extra $50.00 a month from every household, allegedly for community improvement. But the fine print made it clear the funds would go to Lakeview Ventures, one of her shell companies. She was going all in. That's when I made my move. Harlan and I met with Tom Rourke, a regional executive at Silver Pine Development Group, the actual owners of Cedar Brook Lake. The meeting took place in a modest law office 2 towns over, far from curious HOA eyes. Tom looked tired. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair a little too gray for someone in his 40s. "Let me guess," he said, half smiling. "You're here because of Elaine Brewster." I nodded. "Let's just say I'm offering a simpler alternative." They leaned forward. "She's been in negotiations with us for months, but her financing is creative." Translation, I asked. "She doesn't have the money," he replied flatly. "She's been stringing us along, promising investors, bridging loans, community assessments. We need a clean exit. The lake's not a core asset for us anymore." I slid a folder across the table. "An all-cash offer, $375,000, 0 cents. Close in 7 days." Tom blinked. "You're serious enough to wire the funds tomorrow," I said. "You want this off your books. I want this in my hands. No inspections, no contingencies, just a clean break." He took a long breath and flipped through the paperwork. "I'll have to run it by the board, but I don't think they'll hesitate." Within 48 hours, I had a preliminary agreement. The property title would go to Delmar Holdings, LLC, a company I formed months earlier for unrelated investments, now serving a very different purpose. No one in the neighborhood would see the name and connect it to me. Not yet. Meanwhile, Elaine continued her parade. She scheduled a community vision meeting to unveil her grand plan. Flyers were posted, balloons were tied to mailboxes. She even catered the event with gourmet sliders and an open wine bar. I didn't attend. I already knew her vision. But I did park just down the street, watching through tinted glass as she waved to residents, laughing and posing with blueprints like some benevolent empress. She had no idea the land under her feet no longer belonged to her fantasy. The next morning, I met with my real estate attorney to finalize the transaction. The lake, 6 acres of water, and a 10-foot perimeter around it was now mine. Privately owned. Below is uncontested. The timing was perfect. Elaine had just pushed the special assessment vote through the HOA board by claiming a simple majority approval from residents, though she conveniently ignored that the HOA bylaws required a 75% homeowner approval for such fees. She thought no one would challenge her. Or she thought wrong. Maya and I celebrated with grilled cheese and root beer floats on our back porch. She didn't know all the details, just that something big had changed. You seem lighter, she said, munching a crust. Let's just say, I smiled, the lake's going to be safe. But the real moment came a few days later at the next HOA meeting. Phew. Elaine had pulled out all the stops. She presented glossy renderings of a new lakeside club, a kayak dock, and premium seating areas with restricted access. Her PowerPoint buzzed with words like prestige, elevated experience, and exclusive enjoyment. I waited until the very end, raising my hand politely. Yes, Mr. Delmar, she said, the faintest edge in her voice. I have a quick question, I said, standing. You mentioned upgrades to the lake amenities. Can you clarify how the HOA plans to fund improvements to a property it doesn't own?
A few murmurs rippled across the room. Elaine frowned. As I've said, we're finalizing negotiations with Silver Pine Development. I held up a copy of the deed. Negotiations are over. She froze. This is a certified property deed, I continued. As of last Friday, the legal owner of Cedarbrook Lake is Delmar Holdings, LLC. And, per Oregon law, all prior use agreements with the HOA expire in 21 days unless the new owner chooses to renew them. A hush fell. Elaine's face drained of color. She stepped forward. That's impossible. You went behind the board? I went through the right channels, I replied evenly. Just like you taught us to. Harlan stood, placing a hand on my shoulder. And from what I've read, the HOA charter doesn't give you the authority to allocate funds toward a property you don't have legal access to. People started whispering. Someone gasped. Another applauded. Elaine tried to regain control, her voice shrill. This is a hostile takeover. No, Elaine, I said, smiling. This is accountability. She stormed out of the meeting, leaving behind her renderings, her balloons, and what was left of her authority. Outside, as people clustered around me with questions and thanks, I saw Maya standing by the curb. She gave me a thumbs up. That moment, more than the deed, more than the strategy, was the real victory. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about reminding people that they weren't powerless. And the lake, it was just the beginning. Owning the lake should have felt like victory. For a few days it did. Neighbors nodded as I walked by. Strangers waved. Even the ones who once looked right through me now offered awkward compliments like, "Didn't expect that move, Jason," or "Bold play." Respect. Maya was back to smiling, planning fishing lessons for some of the younger kids. But the quiet didn't last. Elaine Brewster was many things. Arrogant, manipulative, obsessed with control, but she wasn't stupid. And she sure as hell wasn't going down without a fight. It started subtly. A violation notice for unauthorized outdoor furniture on our front porch. The same chairs we'd had since move-in. Then it snowballed. Improper hedge trimming. Driveway too wide for community code. Mailbox color not consistent with neighborhood palette. They fined me for leaving Maya's bike in the driveway for 12 minutes. I'd gone inside to grab her lunchbox. By the time I came back out, a printed violation was taped to the door with photos. Someone was watching our house. Every day. Didn't stop with me. Clara Robinson got cited for wind chimes that had excessive decibel output. A neighbor named Marcus received a letter about a non-compliant backyard vegetable planter. It had been there for 5 years. Anyone seen talking to me? Anyone connected to our little resistance group? They got hit next. Elaine had turned the HOA into a weaponized bureaucracy. and she was aiming it at all of us. "She's trying to break us," I told Harlan one night as we reviewed the growing pile of violations. "It's targeted harassment." He nodded grimly. "And technically, it's legal. Unless we can prove malicious intent or pattern-based discrimination. We're gonna need receipts." Samuel Washington, our quiet, soft-spoken banking expert, stepped in. He'd spent months compiling spreadsheets on HOA activity, comparing the frequency of violations across residents. What he found was damning. New homeowners received citations at 4x the rate of legacy residents. Families of color, nearly 6x. Properties that were cited repeatedly, most were later purchased by entities tied to Elaine's real estate company. It was systemic, calculated, predatory. Samuel called it economic cleansing in a polo shirt. And Elaine, she knew we were getting close. That's when the rumors started. Whispers at the school pickup line, "I heard Jason's trying to commercialize the lake." Someone said he's building a boat rental business. His daughter got a free ride to private school because of a shady donation. When Maya came home crying again, I nearly lost it. "Dad, people at school are saying we're trashing the neighborhood, that we're trying to ruin everything." She buried her face in my chest. Riel said her mom told her we're bringing down property values, that we should go back to where we came from. Riel's mom was one of Elaine's closest friends, HOA vice president, the same woman who'd once ignored my wave at the pool and had now co-signed a community letter demanding accountability from disruptive residents. I almost called a moving company that night. Almost. Instead, I called Merrick. "Don't you dare run," he growled through the phone. "That's exactly what she wants. That's her pattern. She pushes, she finds, she isolates, until people give up, sell at a loss, and then one of her shell companies buys the home." I sat there in the dark, holding the phone, watching Maya asleep on the couch, curled up with a fleece blanket and her old fishing hat. No, not this time. I wasn't just fighting for a lake anymore. I was fighting for my kids' dignity, for the neighbors too scared to speak, for the ones who already left without a choice. 2 days later, I got a call from Tom Rourke, the same Silver Pine exec who sold me the lake. "Jason," he said, "just a heads up. Elaine's legal team reached out. They're trying to challenge the property sale, claiming the HOA had right of first refusal." I nearly laughed. Did they read the contract? "They're reaching," he said, "but they're desperate. Just wanted you to know. Things might get uglier." And they did. Random city inspections. A letter from the mayor's office requesting documentation of a tree we'd removed 6 months ago. Suddenly, our garbage collection was reevaluated for efficiency, and our bins were skipped 2 weeks in a row. The mayor's cousin, Elaine's godson. Coincidence, right? But pressure does funny things. It doesn't just crush, it catalyzes. Our messaging group ballooned overnight. Residents who'd been silent now vented freely. Diana, the single mom who'd once stayed quiet at meetings, now shared that Elaine had sent a committee to inspect her backyard without notice. They said it was for mosquito control. She texted. 2 days later, I got 5 violation notices. Harlan suggested we start documenting everything: dates, times, photos, recordings. We created a secure Dropbox, invited trusted residents, and watched it fill with evidence. One by one, neighbors stopped, looking over their shoulders, and started standing shoulder to shoulder. At the next HOA meeting, Elaine made her move. Dressed in her usual white blazer and pearls, she stood at the podium and declared that the HOA would sue to reclaim access to Cedarbrook Lake, citing community historical rights and eminent domain precedent. She didn't mention me by name, but the slide behind her read, "Protecting Cedarbrook from outside interference." That's when I stood up. "Outside interference?" I said, calmly walking to the microphone. "You mean residents who legally purchase land you never owned? Residents who've lived here, paid dues, and followed the rules?" Her smile didn't waver. "This is a complex issue, Mr. Delmar." "It's not," I replied. "It's about you trying to rewrite the rules when they no longer serve you, and using your position to punish anyone who pushes back." I turned to the crowd. "Look around. How many of you have gotten a citation in the last month, last week, for things you've done for years with no issue?" Hands shot up, heads nodded. Elaine tried to regain control. "These are standard procedures." "Targeted," I cut in. "Discriminatory, abusive." For once, the room wasn't on her side. That night, Clara whispered as we exited, "You turned the tide." But I knew the real reckoning hadn't even started yet. Because when a bully loses power, they get desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. The final blow didn't come from a lawsuit. It came from a party. Elaine, desperate to assert control after her public humiliation at the HOA meeting, announced a massive founders-only lakeside celebration. She plastered invitations across mailboxes, but conveniently left out all the newer residents. Anyone who wasn't part of her original clique. 60 guests showed up. Champagne flowed. Music blasted from rented speakers. She even installed branded signage, "Cedarbrook Premiere," as if the lake were already hers. But what Elaine didn't know was that 3 days earlier, my legal team had submitted a formal notice to terminate the HOA's recreational use agreement, effective immediately. The grounds? Ongoing environmental neglect, unauthorized commercial activity, and multiple violations of lake stewardship clauses. We didn't even need to wait the full 21 days. That Saturday, as laughter echoed from across the water, I walked toward the lake with Merrick, Harlan, and 2 unexpected guests, my attorney and Officer Rachel Lynn, a community liaison from the local PD I'd quietly briefed. Elaine stood center stage on a small platform, clutching a microphone and raising her glass. "Here's to legacy, to protecting what's ours." And she basked in applause. I stepped forward and picked up a second mic. "Good afternoon, neighbors." The music cut. Conversations froze. Elaine spun around. "Jason, this is a private event. You weren't invited." I smiled. "That's the thing. I believe there's been a misunderstanding about who has the right to invite whom." I nodded to my attorney, who handed me a thick document. I held it up high. "This is a legal deed. As of 2 weeks ago, I am the sole owner of Cedarbrook Lake and the surrounding 10-foot perimeter. Effective today, all prior access agreements are null and void, which means, unfortunately, everyone here is trespassing." Gasps spread like wildfire. Elaine's face flushed crimson. "You can't do this," she snapped. "The HOA has standing rights." "Which expired," I said, flipping to the final page. "And, per the termination clause, your violation of late care standards allows for immediate revocation." I gestured to Officer Lynn. "I've asked her to supervise a peaceful exit. You have 15 minutes to collect your belongings." Elaine stood frozen, mouth agape, unable to compute the collapse of her kingdom. As guests began packing up in stunned silence, several of them threw her side eyes that said everything. "You dragged us into this, and you lost." Later that night, I published a detailed, open letter to the community, explaining everything, how Elaine had tried to buy the lake under their noses, how she'd weaponized the HOA for personal profit, how her shell companies were acquiring homes at suspiciously low rates. I attached screenshots, public records, a timeline, receipts. By morning, the HOA board was in chaos. Sapphira Duskland, the florist who'd once backed down under Elaine's threats, stood up at an emergency meeting and said something I'll never forget. "We've been afraid for too long. And fear doesn't protect property values. It only protects power." Applause erupted. Within 72 hours, 3 board members resigned. Elaine launched a last-ditch smear campaign. She circulated emails accusing me of destroying neighborhood unity, of turning neighbors against each other, and, my personal favorite, waging psychological warfare through weaponized property acquisition. It didn't work, because the next thing I revealed changed everything. Unbeknownst to anyone, even Harlan and Merrick, I had been quietly purchasing mortgage notes on multiple homes in Cedarbrook Hills. Through my investment network and Samuel's banking contacts, I'd legally acquired lien control over 18 properties, including Elaine's. "I'm not calling in the debt," I told the neighborhood at a town hall meeting. "I'm offering to refinance these homes at below market rates, as long as the community agrees to 3 reforms. Term limits for all HOA board members, mandatory financial transparency and third-party audits, creation of an independent resident ethics committee." No one objected. In fact, the vote was unanimous. Elaine was removed as HOA president by a near-total majority. She tried to rally her allies to fight back, but most had either resigned, been exposed, or were quietly begging me for fishing passes for their kids. I didn't gloat, but I'll admit, it felt good when Veronica Palmer, one of Elaine's staunchest defenders, showed up at my door, asking if her son could join Maya's new conservation club. "I thought you said we didn't belong," I reminded her gently. She lowered her eyes. "I was wrong." I nodded. "The program starts Saturday. We'd be happy to have him." 3 weeks later, Elaine's final act of desperation came in the form of an illegal visit to the lake. My security cameras caught her and 2 HOA loyalists pouring something into the water from an unlabeled bottle, attempting to fake an algae bloom. The footage went straight to the police. She was charged with criminal trespassing and attempted environmental contamination. An audit of HOA finances uncovered misappropriation of funds and years of discriminatory enforcement patterns. Lawsuits followed. She sold her home, quietly, discreetly, and moved out under the cover of night. Cedarbrook Hills was no longer her empire. At the next community meeting, we officially renamed the lake Clara's Cove, after my late wife. I transferred ownership to a non-profit trust, ensuring it could never be developed, never be privatized again. 1 year after the first violation notice landed on my doorstep, Maya and I hosted Cedarbrook's first family fishing day. Over 50 families showed up. Kids laughed, parents mingled, and for the first time in a long time, people smiled without looking over their shoulders. As the sun dipped behind the pines, Maya sat beside me on the dock, feet dangling over the water. "Do you think Mom would like it here?" she asked softly. I looked out at the glistening lake, the ripples catching the light. "You would have loved it." And I think somewhere she was watching too, because the fight wasn't just about land. It was about healing, about standing up when no one else would, and about turning a place of pain into a place of peace. Sometimes the biggest battles don't happen in courtrooms or city halls. They happen in quiet neighborhoods, behind trimmed hedges and manicured lawns, where power hides behind politeness and control wears the mask of community values. But here's the truth. Power built on fear doesn't last, and silence only feeds bullies. Jason Delmar didn't start this war. He didn't come to Cedar Brook Hills looking for a fight. He came with his daughter, grieving a loss, hoping for peace. What he found was a system that punished those who didn't fit in, and a leader who twisted rules for personal gain. But with truth, strategy, and the courage to stand firm, he turned the tables. He didn't just buy a lake. He reclaimed a future. He didn't just defeat Elaine Brewster. He inspired a community to open its eyes, find its voice, and write a new chapter. One based on fairness, transparency, and dignity. So what's the lesson? Never underestimate someone who's fighting for something bigger than themselves. Because when you push a good person too far, they stop asking for permission and start rewriting the rules. If this story moved you, comment 1 below. If you think we should improve the next video, comment 0. We read every suggestion. And if you've ever felt powerless in the face of authority, remember this: you're not alone. And you have more power than you think. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next story.